three combined arms armies and, now 9 months of campaigning this year, they've managed to advance, you know, in total some, 30, 35 kilometers or so from where the initial Russian line was near Avdiivka. Um, that's not terribly great performance. And we know the Russians are like isolating those armies and trying really hard to not send anything from there to the Kursk group. So um, that seems to be the decision that the Kremlin has leaned into for now. And I'm pretty confident that unless the Russians make a major decision, mobilize a lot of forces, deploy a large group, substantially re-engineer the way that they're currently fighting the fight at the theater level, I think that Ukrainian salient will likely survive through the winter.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by a regular guest here on Frontline, George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War. He's the head of their Russia team. George, always a pleasure. Welcome back.
Good to see you as always, James. Thanks for having me.
When we spoke last in August, it was shortly after Ukraine had launched its incursion into the Kursk region of Russia. Here we are almost a month on. What is your assessment of how the incursion is going now?
Yeah, look, it's disrupting the Russian theater level operations at scale. It has not changed the tactical situation in the east and Donetsk. There's been a lot of smart analysts and a lot of ink written about how, look, the Russians have not pulled their main, best trained, most capable combat units that are currently driving towards the operationally significant town of Perros. That's not changed. But there are other effects that I think other people are not paying attention to, which is, look, it's caused the Russians to move units from other parts of the theater, which don't pay immediate dividends right now, but they spoil how the Russians would want to use other forces in space and time after the Pokrovsk operation culminates and ultimately concludes, right? The Russians supposedly were preparing to conduct a attack across the international border from Kursk into Sumy. That was one of the reasons attributed for why the Ukrainians conducted this attack. It was a spoiling operation. And then the Russians have pulled forces from currently the low priority areas of the front line, the south, near Zaporizhia and Kherson, but also from the Liman direction and Luhansk Oblast, right? Those are pre-positioned forces that the Russians would like to use for future operations. The Soviets, in their doctrine, they have this concept called the operational art, operativное искусство in Russian. And part of the core tenets of skillful campaign planning is, look, when you fight, you get tired, and then you got to take a pause, you got to rest. Like, that's called culmination. But if you're skillful about how you prearrange your operational groups, your armies, and you skillfully do your campaigns, you fight your campaigns in such a manner that when group one fights and gets tired and culminates naturally, you have in the breach and the lurch waiting a second group that will then get the baton passed to them, and they will continue offensive operations. And while group one rests, the second one continues to fight. What the Russians have done with this Kursk incursion is they've stripped away the elements that constitute group two and group three that the Russian command might have been waiting upon to then employ in coming months. And what we see now is that the Russians have degraded their ability to do that. And so what it is doing is it's actually throwing off not the current plan for the current campaign, but it is indeed throwing off the future campaigns.
That's really interesting. And look, none of us really know what the true objective of the incursion was from a Ukrainian point of view, but a lot of people speculated it was designed to divert troops away from the front line in the east of Ukraine. But even if that hasn't happened so far, you're saying it has still had a significant effect.
That's correct. So, the Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief, General Alexander Syrskyi, he gave some statements to CNN last week, and he did state that one of the objectives was to pull Russian forces away from the Pokrovsk direction and put them into Kursk. And so far, and he acknowledged that is not what has happened so far. But there's many objectives, right? There's multiple objectives. Zelensky's talked about what the objectives are. And just because you don't achieve one of your objectives doesn't mean that it's a failed undertaking, or that, objective 2 and 3 and 4 are not being achieved. So let's talk briefly about some of the effects that the operation is indeed achieving. Those are chiefly, like I said, gunking up the campaign space and time and planning for what the Russian, command at the theater level would want to do after the current Pokrovsk campaign culminates. Number two, it imposes that, resourcing dilemma and strategic planning dilemma on Putin. For 2.5 years, the Kremlin saw this 1,000-kilometer stretch of international border between Belarus and occupied Kharkiv as essentially a safe zone that they don't have to, adequately protect. And the Ukrainians called the Russian bluff. they have now imposed a new planning requirement on Putin. Is he going to actually station tens of thousands of troops to adequately defend an additional 1,000 kilometers of frontage in the theater, which is not a trivial undertaking? That's going to, and if Putin decides that he is indeed going to upfront and put in those resources, then for Putin to protract this war into year 3 and year 4 and beyond, that's going to decrease his planning assumptions and decrease the resource availability that he has. So I think that's actually quite important. And look, if Putin decides that he's not going to reinforce the international border, then in some regards, that's even better, because then it gives the Ukrainians opportunities to further embarrass Russia, widen the salient that's currently in Kursk, and create new ones in other parts of the international border.
And what about the situation, George, in Kursk Oblast itself at the moment? How well have Ukraine been able to hold on to the territory they've captured? To what extent have Russia been able to push back?
Every single day, we're studying in minute detail how the contours of the Ukrainian front line is changing, and it ebbs and flows. The rate of advance for the Ukrainians definitely has slowed over the last month, especially in the last 2 weeks. And when we collect geolocated data and other parts of information, we see that the Russians have succeeded in taking back very small pieces of territory on the periphery, and territory continues to change hands. So it seems to be consolidating, it seems to be stabilizing. I think net the Ukrainian gains are still slowly going up there, but it's actually become a lot less interesting. And I suspect that we're actually not going to see a drastic change in the size of the salient, barring either belligerent deploying a significant large amount of forces. The Ukrainians have some brigades in a reserve that they've not yet committed. It remains a question where the Ukrainian command will use them. Will they use them to reinforce Donetsk and the Donbass and Perros, or will they send them to Kursk to do something there? We don't know. The Russian response, as for them, they've decided to not massively introduce reserve forces into Kursk. They've deployed, the estimates vary from 20 to 30,000, perhaps a little bit higher number of forces. But the U.S. intelligence community assesses that in order to remove the current salient that the Ukrainians have, the Russians need 50,000 forces. And the Russians, by all indicators, have not sent that. I mean, they've sent maybe half of that. So they've sent enough to stabilize it, slow the Ukrainian advance, and maybe tactically retake a couple villages here or there in the periphery, but not remove it. And what we know is that, look, the Russians, they really don't want to tap into the main combat force that they have in Pokrovsk. Just to give it a sense of scale, right now the Russians in the direction of Pokrovsk, they have at least 2 combined arms army, maybe 3 combined arms armies to conduct this major operation. There's the 41st Combined Arms Army, which is sort of the main element. That's from the Central Military District in Siberia. And then you have the Donetsk People's Republic proxy forces, which were just recently reorganized. They had been called since 2014, the Donetsk, First Army Corps. That recently was reorganized into another Combined Arms Army. It's now called the 51st Combined Arms Army. And then there's a 3rd Combined Arms Army, which is operating in the area as well, the 3rd. And so when you think of the scale, right, and none of these Russian armies are actually up to their doctrinal end strength. A Russian Combined Arms Army, generally speaking, is about 50,000 people on paper, depending on its composition and what kind of units it's staffed with. But on paper, these are organizations that have 50,000 people, right? I'm confident that it's lower than that because all of these Russian units are operating below their doctrinal end strength. But this is a tremendously large amount of combat power. 2 combined arms armies, 3 combined arms armies to put behind a town with a population of, a pre-war population of, 60 or 70,000 people. And if you look at how the Russians have advanced in the direction of Perros since the beginning of this year, or even from the front lines as it existed from 2014, what the Russians started with in 2022, with 3 combined arms armies and, now 9 months of campaigning this year, they've managed to advance, in total some, 30, 35 kilometers or so from where the initial Russian line was near Avdiivka. That's not terribly great performance. And we know the Russians are isolating those armies and trying really hard to not send anything from there to the Kursk group. So that seems to be the decision that the Kremlin has leaned into for now. And I'm pretty confident that unless the Russians make a major decision, mobilize a lot of forces, deploy a large group, substantially re-engineer the way that they're currently fighting the fight at the theater level, I think that Ukrainian salient will likely survive through the winter.
It's interesting you mentioned Avdiivka. I was going to ask you about how strategically significant Pokrovsk is, because it seems like throughout the conflict, there have been these kind of focal points, whether it was Bakhmut, whether it was Avdiivka, now it's Pokrovsk, and sometimes they take on more symbolic importance than they do strategic. So were Pokrovsk to fall to the Russians, how significant would that be?
That's a very interesting question. A lot to unpack there, actually. So Pokrovsk is operationally significant. And in military science, we make a differentiation between levels of war. There's strategy, the strategic level of war. There's the operational level of war, operation referring to the waging of campaigns, and then the tactical level. Tactical level is force on force, essentially battles, that you might read about. Pokrovsk is more significant than you would have at the tactical level. It is significant at the operational level, but I would argue it's not strategic. Strategic being your entire country's resources and your wellspring and the way that you sold together campaigns to achieve your strategic objectives. Pokrovsk is operationally significant because it is a major logistics hub. It sits at, there's an important railroad terminal that's there that supplies Ukrainian forces, not only in the vicinity of Pokrovsk, but elsewhere in the southern part of the Donetsk Oblast, as well as the other large fortress city to the east of Pokrovsk, Toretsk. And not only is there a railroad hub there, but there's also some large arterial roads and highways that are used to, get guys in, get guys out, get, ammunition and fuel in and out and vice versa. And if the Russians were to seize Pokrovsk, or even not necessarily seize it, but deny the Ukraine's ability to use that infrastructure as a logistics hub to supply their frontline forces, then that will degrade Ukraine's ability at the operational level, which will affect the tactical battles for those specific villages in the vicinity that are supported by Pokrovsk, to be able to defend themselves. If the Russians seize Pokrovsk, which is not a given at this time, it would be bad, but it wouldn't be catastrophic. Because, look, it would be difficult for the Ukrainians to be able to, I think, liberate Pokrovsk. It's a fairly large city, and we know that urban combat and trying to seize cities from one side or the other is an extremely difficult and costly undertaking. We saw that with the Battle of Bakhmut. But if the Ukrainians were to lose Pokrovsk, it wouldn't necessarily mean that Ukraine is therefore condemned to lose the war or lose the rest of Donetsk Oblast. It would not be good, but it wouldn't be the end of the world. And look, it's the same thing. When the Russians seized Bakhmut back in February 2023, it was not the end of the world. The Russians spent an inordinate amount of combat power trying to seize that. It destroyed the Wagner Group as an organization. It catalyzed the self-destruction of Yevgeny Prigozhin. And objectively, you pull out the calipers, since February 2023, the Russians have advanced no more than 10 kilometers further west of Bakhmut. I mean, they culminated and they've been pretty much stuck there. And it's, the seizure of Bakhmut did not fundamentally degrade Ukraine's ability to defend the rest of the eastern province at that place and time, and since then. So Pokrovsk's a little different because it supports Toretsk, but seizure of Avdiivka, seizure of Bakhmut, these larger operationally significant cities are important. They're very defensible. They'll be very difficult to liberate in the future, but it's not going to be strategically, at the strategic level of war, it's not going to degrade Ukraine's ability to keep fighting.
And what about the casualty rate at the moment? Are Russia continuing to sustain heavy casualties as they advance on Pokrovsk?
They are. It's really difficult to gauge from open sources, what the exact casualty ratio is. But the Russians and Ukrainians, they report that the Russians have, like a 10-1 artillery advantage over the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian forces that are there, they're really tired. They're under strength. They're undermanned. They need to have reinforcements and some rotations. But all the combat footage that we collect, indicates that the Russians are taking heavy losses for the advances that they make. The Ukrainians, while they have a disadvantage in artillery, they have an advantage in drones, both in terms of quantity and technological implementation. So the Russians continue to lose men and vehicles to these precise Ukrainian FPV drones. And the Ukrainians have ceded more territory in the last 2 weeks in particular, because they've made the intelligent decision to not order their men to die in place over fields and small villages and hamlets. They've been ordered to withdraw tactically from certain locations to avoid being encircled or enveloped. And right now, the Ukrainians are currently on they're defending sort of their third or fourth line of field fortifications and defenses before you get to the immediate vicinity of the outskirts of Kursk. So the Russian rate of advance, as they've fought through the first and the second lines of defenses, which were not as well prepared as the third and fourth, slowed, and it continues to slow. And what we're seeing now is actually the penetration depth, the rate of penetration depth decreasing, while the Russians seem to be prioritizing widening the breach, widening the penetration. They're fighting on the southern flank, and they on September 1st, they started a new offensive operation in Vuhledar in the south, which is sort of to the south of Perros. So they're now trying to close some of the pockets that they've created with this long and deep penetration. It's actually not that long, relatively speaking. It's, like I said, it's at max 35 to 40 kilometers. And so they're trying to make it more stable so that they don't risk, become vulnerable to counterattack or something. So I expect in the coming days that the rate of Russian advance will slow, going laterally, but they will build it out in terms of its girth.
I want to come on to some of the things we've been seeing from the Kremlin in recent weeks in a moment. But first of all, I mean, it's interesting how 6 or 7 weeks ago, a lot of these discussions were dominated by the arrival of the F-16s in Ukraine, and then that kind of got overtaken by the offensive operation in Kursk. Have we seen any evidence of the F-16s making a noticeable difference on the front line in recent weeks?
Yeah, difficult to say. Again, we've seen the Ukrainians use fixed-wing aircraft to support the operations in Kursk. They've been using, American-provided JDAM bombs to take out bridges over the Sam River, which is important for, doing what we call battlefield air interdiction, or BAI, essentially geographically isolating sections of the battlefield to prevent adversaries from getting in or out when you're trying to conduct operations there. So that's a new and interesting capability. It's not clear to me if it's F-16s that are flying those missions to drop the JDAMs, or if different Ukrainian pilots are using Ukrainian Soviet-era MiGs that are been retrofitted to accept the JDAM to launch those. But really, the platform isn't important, because when you give them more bandwidth to operate aircraft, you increase the capabilities to operate in the air domain. And capabilities are always more important than individuals, named systems. The primary thing that I think the F-16s are doing, and I base this off of this public statements from Ukrainian officials, is they're using the F-16s primarily for air defense at this time. They augment the Ukrainian air defense umbrella, and they use them to intercept, missiles, enemy drones, that sort of thing. So, insofar as they play a role in air defense, it's very difficult to actually see that, because you can see the strikes on bridges, you can see when they drop the bombs on the ground-based targets, because usually there's footage of that. But when it gets rolled up into the larger defensive game, as part of the larger air defense umbrella, augmenting the Patriots and the German-provided systems and all the other stuff, and they just shoot down drones and that sort of thing, it's difficult to sort of disaggregate the role that the F-16s play. But nonetheless, it's an important capability. And right now, one of the Pentagon debates is about, do we give the Ukrainians the JASM? It's an air-launched cruise missile. With a range that exceeds that of ATACMS. And if we give the Ukrainians the JASM, number one, it's great, because we have a lot of JASMs. We have a fairly large stockpile that we can use relative to ATACMS, which we have relatively fewer of. And then number two, that will substantially increase Ukraine's ability to do this battlefield air interdiction by using it not only for air defense, but using the platform for air-to-ground attacks.
I mean, I suppose that does raise the question, George, and I'm not necessarily asking you to speculate on the internal decision-making in the White House, but if the US have more JASMs and they're longer range than the ATACMS, why hasn't that been considered before?
Truthfully, I don't know the answer, because the go-to reason has been they're concerned about escalation, and to what extent they're actually genuinely concerned about that versus they hide behind fears of escalation as sort of the rhetorical justification for other reasons is unclear to me. And I really don't know. I've spoken with policymakers who have been actually genuinely concerned about the risk of, catastrophic horrors, vertical escalation in Ukraine, like the Russians use a tactical nuclear weapon or something, which is very unlikely, or, the Russians escalating horizontally and then saying, all right, look, American and NATO intelligence support and facilitate these attacks through collection and targeting support for the Ukrainian military, making them de facto parties to the conflict, and therefore we're going to start retaliating by striking NATO, right? Like, that's another kind of escalation that we want to avoid, that we're concerned about as well. And I don't know which is which or to what extent the policymakers are grappled by that. Another reason has to do with the bureaucratic politics within the Pentagon. Um, Whenever we want to pull away resources from one stockpile, right? Those are in principle earmarked for contingency plans for different combatant commands, for different commanders, and you decrease American readiness when you send these weapons. I would argue that, look, it's better to use weapons that we pay for and have an inventory for the real war that has serious implications for NATO and American interests, as opposed to, say, the hypothetical war that might occur but is not happening now and would more likely happen if the adversary is perceived that the United States will not treat current wars seriously, and you can indeed bully them and get them to not be decisive about defeating current wars. So it's a combination of these factors, and I wish I could tell you, but we continue to boil the frog. We continue to make the right decision, sort of a day late and a dollar short. And I hope that we will do the right thing vis-a-vis JASMs and eventually ATACMs, because the Ukrainians need that capability.
Just wanted to ask you, George, about something that the ISW mentions in your latest Russian offensive campaign assessment, which is how the Kremlin has been leveraging the weekend's Russian regional elections to try and get veterans of the war in Ukraine into leadership positions in Russia. And partly you say that's because of concerns the Kremlin may have about domestic support for the war. I mean, a lot of people have focused on that since the incursion into Kursk. How big an issue do you think that is for Putin, that he's worried about how the war is perceived internally?
Putin was a KGB officer in the late Soviet period, in the late 80s, when Glasnost and Perestroika were going on, and there was more political freedom, more freedom of thought and exchange. And it was actually some of those reforms that Gorbachev undertook. Gorbachev didn't want to blow up or destroy the Soviet Union. He wanted to have a reformation to make Soviet communism essentially work better. But that dose of more political freedom, political organization, freedom of information proved lethal, because you started to have people questioning the government myths, questioning the throughout the legacy of the Soviet Union, the narrative that the state was putting out there, the history of the state, just abusing the population. And then also, with the war in Afghanistan, with a whole bunch of, killed Russians over the course of a decade in a foreign war that was not going well, the mothers of killed service members started to actually create, civil society organizations and hold demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations, and that sort of thing. And the Soviet police state was not willing to crack down upon that. So Putin's very alive to the fact that, look, when you have a cleavage of society, of which Russian veterans are going to become a sizable portion, especially not just veterans that, sort of served, did their time, got out. We're talking about veterans that are wounded, many of whom who have serious life-altering injuries, like missing a limb or permanently crippled, right? They no longer fight. When you return those people to society, and now they have to rely on a support system of the state and their community and their families, this has essentially created a new political cleavage within Russia, which is a liability for the Kremlin, especially in the long term, and especially if among these people, there becomes a prevalent idea of, like, why the hell are we fighting this war in Ukraine, into the third year, into the fourth year, into the fifth year, if we're not achieving our objectives, right? And so I think what the Kremlin's doing is they've launched a clear campaign. It's called the Times of Heroes initiative, where they essentially are trying to incorporate Russian veterans into political life. They're trying to get them involved in governance at the local level, at the federal level. They're trying to get them involved in, hearing complaints of the community, from shaping government policies. And this gives this new political cleavage, some degree of agency in policy making. It helps them feel that they're not being ignored or isolated by the state. It actually brings them into the fold and gives them some privileges and powers, both political and monetary, right? And what that does is essentially it co-opts this cleavage so that it actually becomes a reinforcing arm of the state, as opposed to a potential liability that could help turn the tide against the current state policy. So it's very intelligent, it's very smart, and it's helping Putin, protract this war effort for as long as he wants to.
But it's also fascinating how clearly Putin is worried about making too much of the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk. He wants to play it down almost. And you point out that the Russian regional elections would have been the perfect moment to get rid of the current acting governor of Kursk Oblast, but he doesn't want to do that because that would draw attention to what's happening in Kursk.
Exactly. Yeah. So in our update that we published yesterday on September 9, the incumbent governor won. He'll be serving there for another 5 years, so he's avoided a potential outing for now. But it seems the Kremlin political strategy and messaging strategy here is to sort of portray the Kursk incursion as the new normal, to get people used to it, to acclimate them to it, to not have them think and panic over it, because the Russians genuinely can't really do anything about it, as we discussed, in terms of their means. And it was very interesting. There was a lot of messaging from the Russians yesterday saying, look, voter turnout in Kursk was very, very high. Everything's basically hunky-dory. We were able to conduct our political processes like normal, and all's good and well. And the governor's been reelected, and sort of the political Potemkin village equivalent of what Catherine the Great would do back in the day. So this is a further indication that, look, you can indeed push back on the Russians. They're actually quite bad at crisis management and preparing for unplanned contingencies, and they sort of sheepishly ad-lib their way through it and then accept the costs and the embarrassments that we impose on them, sort of with their tail tucked between their legs, and they don't lash out, and they don't escalate vertically or horizontally in a crazy way.
And I should say, for anyone who's interested, the ISW's Russian offensive campaign assessments every day are essential reading if you're interested in finding out more. George, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thanks for having me, James. Always good to see you, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.